Well, Ernie, I'm glad that you have taken time out to speak with me a little bit. You did an important service for the University recently, of Toledo recently, it seems to me, by bringing in one Michael Roos to lead some conferences and to give some public lectures, and invited me to be a respondent on one occasion to those. I want to talk a little bit about Michael Roos. Represents a field that we generally call, I guess, sociobiology. It's an attempt to root ethics in evolutionary theory. It brings together a dialogue between biologists and theologians, among others. So I want to just talk a little bit about it. Why don't you tell me a little bit about why you did this and set up this whole speaking engagement for this Michael Roos and what that was all about?
Well, Jim, Professor Charles Blatch in the philosophy department and I were conducting a seminar in evolutionary ethics for the honors program at the university. And the University of Toledo Foundation, its Program Excellence Award, funded a week-long distinguished professorship or distinguished lectureship in conjunction with this seminar. We brought Professor Michael Roos on campus. He gave a series of 3 public lectures and some professional lectures to biology and philosophy, and met intensively with the students. They really enjoyed speaking and interacting with a philosopher of some repute in his area.
I guess part of this was to set up a dialogue situation, wasn't it? I noticed you structured it that way, that after he gave his public lectures, you had people from different disciplines responding to him, including myself speaking out of a theological tradition. So evidently you wanted to set up dialogue and discussion, and I know there was strong feelings about a lot of his thoughts, and I think you succeeded in accomplishing some of that intense dialogue.
Well, too often in the university, people and students are cubbyholed into departments, and the honors program and programs like this are some way to get together people from disparate areas and see really how intellectual ideas in one area really have influences and have been influenced by other disciplines. So we had sociologists, anthropologists, biologists, theologians, philosophers, a wide variety of people who would comment on Roos's ideas. And this was really the goal of this, to demonstrate to students and to the population of a whole that learning is learning, and it really doesn't make any difference what discipline you're in.
I think it's general perception we need more cross-disciplinary work, and that it really fructifies each of the disciplines. It puts us on our toes, and I mean, I know that it forced me to read Professor Roos's book, and to one of them at least, and to try to react to all of that. Let's talk a little bit about this evolutionary ethics and what that's all about. As you well know, I became very critical of Professor Roos's viewpoints on it, and so I think what I'd like to do is sort of lay out a foundation so we can understand, first of all, what he's saying, or what people generally in this field are saying. My own sense is that one has to have some perception of evolution as it's currently understood scientifically in order to appreciate what Dr. Roos was talking about. Maybe, Ernie, you want to say a little bit about how evolution is understood. It takes us back to Darwin, Origin of Species, 1859, things like natural selection and gradual evolutionary process and so on. So why don't we try to get a little clearer view of that?
Well, if you look at Darwin's work, taken all together, this tremendous volume of work that he did, he seemed to have 2 major goals in mind, I think. One was to try to explain the diversity of life that you see on Earth and where it all came from. But from his notebooks and his later works, what I think was probably a much more important concern on him was to try to explain and understand human behavior, the actual where the mind came from, and why people behave the way he did. In fact, one of his lesser known, but one of his 3 major works has to do with the origins of human behavior and expressions of emotion and things like this. And in his Descent of Man in 1871, he devotes a large amount of time to trying to explain and understand how moral sentiments arose, and how the idea that people would think about questions such as good and ill, or how they would behave in a moral fashion, how that would come about. And he did it in his typically exhaustive, thorough, comparative method. Modern-day animal behaviorists might question some of his interpretations of what animals were doing, but nevertheless, he really was trying to understand how human moral sentiments came about. This was picked up by a number of people in the late 1800s. In fact, Herbert Spencer predated him somewhat along these ideas.
Well, one of the movement. Let's make sure now we have this scientific theory in mind. Let's talk a little bit about the natural, because it wasn't just that there was evolution and that human beings evolved from lower forms of life from the animal world, but also Darwin had a theory about exactly how you do that. And so, and he contrasted his own view with others, or we've had contrasting views historically. I associate Darwin with that notion of natural selection. Why don't we just say a little bit about how that works and what the alternate approach would be?
Well, with his mechanism of natural selection, which was really just one of many mechanisms he espoused, but it was certainly the one he thought was the causative mechanism for most evolution, essentially said that if we can simplify it, if there's a wide variety of a trait in a population, and in this case we could say a wide variety of types of behavior, then if these traits are inherited, then if the trait tends to serve the benefit of an individual, there's a greater chance that that the individual carrying that trait might have more offspring, and hence there's a greater chance that there would be more individuals expressing that trait in the next generation.
Let's give a concrete example of that.
Well, we could take a concrete example along these lines, and let's say, for example, that there is an inherited biologically based behavior such as well, let's go with something we're probably going to be talking about, such as doing good things for your relatives. Organisms that would exhibit that trait, if it were selected for, would, according to the theory, would tend to have more offspring, and therefore in the next generation there would be more in the population who would be exhibiting that trait, doing good things for your relatives, than in a population where this trait did not exist. And
all right, I wonder if we have to go back even a little further to the animal world. Let's take an example from the animal world that where the ways that we think that things would have evolved, or how natural selection would have worked.
Well, one can go away from behavior then and take some of the more classic biological examples. That if there happened to be a trait that would appear at random in a population, say a certain coloration of an insect, within a small population of insects there may be black insects and white insects.
Okay.
If the predators could not see the black insects, the odds would be that the white insects would be eaten more, there'd be more black insects around to breed, and more of the next generation would be black than white.
Right. So
that trait would have been selected.
Exactly. Yes. And so this is a random kind of thing, isn't it? I mean,
well,
at least
the original appearance of the trait is random.
Right.
The selection is not random at all. It is very ad hoc. So evolution has a randomness to the fact that there's no guarantee that any trait necessarily will appear or does appear, but then it becomes very creative in terms of selection.
Once you got black insects the predators can't see, then this trait is going to be carried on because the black ones survive. So I mean, that's very causative. I mean, you can pin that down, but the fact that we're black and white to begin with could be a random event. Okay, so I mean that gives us some sense of evolution and how the whole. Do we want to say something about the human evolution to get this into the picture here, and how one perceives that. I think that I get the one place Roos says in his book, I think, that the walking upright preceded the question of the brain size. Both those things come into play, don't they?
Yes,
in the way we look at it.
More in human history instead of evolution. If one goes back to the early hominid species, Homo erectus and Homo habilis, these were hominids, relatives of ours, but not the same species, who had slightly different physical characteristics than we have now. But they tended to be upright walkers, live in small groups. They were hunter-gatherers that roamed the plains or savannas of Africa. They lived in an entirely different environment that we live in now. But they're not that far away from us in terms of evolutionary time. We may be looking at something from 200,000 to 1 million years at the most, which seems a long time for us, but in terms of evolution, that's not, considering the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, that's not much. So
the humans arrive in the evolutionary scene quite late in the whole process. Very late.
Very much so, yes. We are, according to some estimates now, no more than maybe 200,000 years old. Maybe a little less, maybe a little more, but that's pretty new.
The human strain that we know, as we broke away from, say, the chimpanzee strain.
Well, that took place about 2.5 to 4 million years ago. But our species, Homo sapiens, is about maybe 200 to 500,000 years old, in that range.
Right. And so all of this becomes sort of common ways of describing the human origin in the world of biology today.
Yeah.
And it really serves as the basis for a lot of what Michael Roos and the sociobiologists are all about. In other words, there's a firm base in this evolutionary theory. These people are Darwinians. They're followers of Darwin and have sort of tried to go beyond him, I suppose, or suggest directions in which his thought would take us. I mean, one way that people used his thought in ethical terms was what we call social Darwinianism. And you mentioned Herbert Spencer before, and we might sort of connect all this in with him, but I mean, my impression is that these people really thought that evolution had a purpose and an aim, that it was moving in positive directions towards greater coherence and so on, and that became a model for human society. And that you could look at the whole thing and you could say, well, there is a selection process going on in the human community, and that's why some people sort of the survival of the fittest, they get ahead and make it in the world and become famous or successful, or they have money or power and so on. And that, on the other hand, there are other people who are sort of defective. And at some extremes of the social Darwinists, as I read it, said, well, you just forget about those people. I mean, they're not helpful to the human species, and if you just neglect them or let them die out, the human population as a whole will be better. Maybe one figure that emerges as sort of an example of how all this was supposed to work would be some of our philanthropists, like Andrew Carnegie, for example. He would be one. Well, he's a survival of the fittest. He makes it. He's an entrepreneur. He moves ahead, is successful, and we want to have more people like him. And therefore, because he's been able to accomplish this, then he gives his money philanthropically to places that might give other people, as they like to say, an equal start or a fair shot at making it in the world. That was part of the theory, I think, that was behind that kind of philanthropy. So we have a movement known as social Darwinianism that tried to use Darwin's biological ideas and apply them to the social scene. And what it comes out of that is, of course, a whole ethics. You do get an ethics. You have a view of what the good society is about and how you're supposed to get there. So maybe you want to comment a little bit about this social Darwinianism?
Well, I think social Darwinism, the fault with it is that there's the idea, as you had mentioned, that evolution is going somewhere, that there's some sort of progress to it. And it was colored very much by the fact that the people who were proposing it viewed that evolution was going towards them, that the culmination of evolution, the idea that evolution is a chain of being or a ladder headed somewhere, and they were at the top of it. The white European male society, particularly the British society, was where evolution was going, and therefore that was good, that where evolution was going was good, and you should do things either to foster the direction that evolution was going or to prevent it from going someplace else. That fit in very well with their society at the time.
I noticed Michael Ruse makes a big thing out of saying that evolution doesn't have a clear direction, or it isn't part of some overall scheme. I think that separates him out from other evolutionary kind of thinkers. I mean, I think out of my own field of Teilhard de Chardin, the great Jesuit paleontologist and man with a very good scientific background himself, one of the foremost experts on the geology of China, who had a very different sense of evolution, that evolution had purpose, direction, that it was moving towards what he called the omega point, that this greater complexity that we found in the evolutionary chain produced greater consciousness, and that even once the humans appeared on the earth, that this whole process continued as humans gathered together. He had put great significance on the fact that where we lived is a globe, it's a sphere, and that as populations increase, human interactions must increase, and that we're moving towards a world in which we learn to cooperate, where consciousness becomes deeper, and we move towards what he called omega point, which in his theology equated with the risen Christ, the universal Christ that we find mentioned in the first chapters of Colossians and Ephesians, and also Romans 8, where we talk about the whole world sort of moving forward as though it's pregnant and going to bring forth some new fruit, bring us to a conclusion. So there is our evolutionary type thinkers around who move into the ethical framework from a very different base than Michael Ruse does. And these people would claim that evolution is going someplace as a purpose, and these people would largely be believers and suggest that God is directing the process and bringing it to culmination.
That's true. From Henri Bergson in the early part of the century on, there have been people who have maintained that evolution has some sort of purpose. But I think the recent studies in the history of how evolutionary thought was being carried out during this century shows that in the 20s, 30s, and 40s there's a conscious effort by evolutionary scientists to make it clear that the idea of progress was not part of evolutionary thought. It seems to have been a necessary component to get evolutionary studies as accepted as a legitimate science, and to remove it from any sort of metaphysical realm which the idea of progress had taken on in the 20s through 40s, to the extent now that it would be extraordinarily rare to find an evolutionary biologist who would, in any sort of scientific discussion, adhere to the idea of progress or direction in evolution, some sort of goal. It is just probably not. Once it is brought into the discussion, it moves out of the realm of science.
Yeah, and that's really important. I mean, that became one of my great criticisms of Michael Ruse, that Michael Ruse has raised up evolutionary theory, which is a scientific theory, into a philosophy and even into a theology, even and that I think you're absolutely right. As soon as that happens, you're into another realm of discourse. I mean, part of my own criticism would be that when the scientist tries to play the metaphysician or tries to play the theologian, then he's into a new ballgame. When you begin to talk about purpose and direction, I do think it is a larger question. And I guess what I object to is the evolutionary scientist making that kind of claim. And I think that then we end up with what I call scientism, that is making an absolute out of the scientific method. And I think Michael Ruse really makes that fundamental error, or at least if he wants to come and play in the theological realm, then he has to deal, it seems to me, with the kinds of question of meaning and purpose that have been discussed by philosophers for many centuries. And I find that he fails to do that.
I think that's probably true, but I think that is the attitude one would normally see from many scientists, that if in fact a question having to do with human behavior, etc., are not acceptable or not at the present time amenable to scientific approaches, then they are considered lesser questions, irrelevant questions, something to be put off for the time, and philosophers or theologians or someone else can set up the rules to deal with those questions. But they just are not taken to be serious questions by scientists who would think that way.
Well, they're not serious within their own discipline, but it becomes important for human beings generally to figure out if the whole human process has meaning or not, whether the whole, whatever humanity's all about, has some larger purpose. I mean, it's hard to function. I mean, one can teach biology or live within the biological world, it seems to me, on that basis. And that becomes one's passion, to investigate empirically what one can find out about the evolutionary process. But the human population as a whole is traditionally, always, and according to my understanding of every culture, has been interested in the larger questions of is there meaning, is there purpose, is there direction to the whole of the human enterprise.
Yes, I think that many evolutionary biologists or scientists as a whole now who would look at evolution and say, when we look at evolutionary history, when we see what has happened, when we see the mechanism involved in evolution, there's no way we can see any sort of purpose or meaning. Nevertheless, humans want there to be one, and it then provides a very fascinating challenge, an intriguing challenge, and a necessary challenge for humans. Then have to come up with their own ideas as to what the meaning and purpose is. They have to establish it on their own. It's very threatening, I think, to some people to be confronted with that. But if evolution says, and it seems to, that there is no discernible meaning or purpose in life, that it goes on, and that certain things are selected here and now, but humans nevertheless want some sort of purpose or meaning, it's incumbent on human thinkers to say, fine, we will establish what the purpose will be, and we'll try to get consensus on it. We will make our own meaning. That, I think, is what evolutionary science, that's the challenge it's throwing out towards philosophy or to theology or to humankind as a whole, saying that we can't deduce purpose anymore. It's not there. We want purpose. We may need it for our psychology. We then have to come up with it.
Well, you're going to come up with it outside of the biological realm. In other words, if I'm looking for the answer to meaning and purpose of life, I'm really not going to look to a biologist. I mean, to find it, I look to the philosophers, to the theologians, to the religious thinkers,
the historians. You see what people have used as purpose, and you evaluate that, and you say, do I want to establish that as my purpose? Do we, as a society, want to establish it and say this is what we mean? But
even again, I think when one views what is happening in the world, or what we learn, whatever the biologist can bring to us about, if the biologist tells me, well, I don't see any purpose within the evolutionary structure. I mean, according to my empirical studies, I mean, that's fine within that discipline. I mean, I understand that. All that represents to me is the limitation of the discipline. In other words, I don't expect that. I don't expect that. I expect you as a biologist to tell me how evolution works. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a great expectation that you're supposed to supply that in some sense. I wouldn't sort of expect that from the beginning, I suppose, is the way I would put it. But one of the questions that arises in relationship to that whole idea of social Darwinism and so on is the question of critique that comes, and one could ask the question morally, well, why would I say that we should not just neglect the weak people? Now, I don't think social Darwinism is that prominent anymore as some sort of a moral option, but historically it was, and it had a lot of credence at one time. But where would we go to say, well, you can't let the weak just go by the wayside, as Spencer might want to let us do here? And from my viewpoint, I'd say, well, I got a higher criterion here. I mean, I have a religious teaching or something that says, a Christian outlook says you don't do that to the poor. I mean, even, if you show me that somehow that's better for the human family, I can't do that. It's the same sort of stuff you get in collectivism, Marxism, or whatever. Well, we'll just forget these people for the purpose of creating the classless society someday. So what I'm saying is there's a sort of moral criterion, I guess, that comes into play here. You want to do 10 seconds on that, Ernie?
Well, I think that I think that historically, if one of the major criticisms of social Darwinism from a philosophical viewpoint was that even if that is the case, if natural selection works that way, if that's what is, there is no reason why you can say that's what ought to be. It's what Hume called the naturalistic fallacy, and what is need not be what ought to be.
Okay. Ernie, a lot of questions remain. But where did we get to in this discussion? We found out something about evolution. That's good. We know Michael Roos is a social biologist. We know that I disagree with some of the things that he had to say, and it raises larger questions. And part of this social Darwinism, this idea of the survival of the fittest in human terms, and making Andrew Carnegie to be the supreme model of human life, it becomes questionable, at least from my theological viewpoint. So it shows the rub, I suppose, between the biologist and the theologian, and the ongoing discussion that we need.